Live. Everywhere. On netrootsradio.com. David Waldman. Kagro. In the morning. Now, here's David Waldman.
Hello. Hi, everybody. How you doing? It's Tuesday, August 4th. It's still Tuesday, August 4th. It's about 5 minutes later than it was last time I told you it was Tuesday, August 4th. 2026, though. Still 2026. Nothing's changed about that. Some sort of audio glitch. I don't know. I'm not certain whether punching the buttons made any difference, but certainly stopping the broadcast and restarting it has made a difference. I don't know what I'm going to do with this file now, or how I will label it. Or maybe we'll do an extra 5 minutes after we disconnect and the West Coast Cookbook and Speakeasy starts, and we'll plug it in to the front. I don't know how the hell we're going to do that. Anyway, we don't want to jip you at the rest of your day or remind ourselves that once again, this is like the 19th time that I've said that the old fallback to the schoolyard days. That's not something you're supposed to say anymore. I've done much better with other words that we tried to eliminate from the vocabulary. That one keeps slipping out. Sorry. Large-scale apologies to the Romani people. My goodness. I don't know. That's a habit that dies harder than most of the rest of them for some reason. We don't want to shortchange you. Gee whiz. I don't think I would be allowed to get away with that. If I used another of the formerly popular slang terminologies that stood in for that. Sorry about that. Wow. Well, I'm an old man. These things happen. Okay, time to get past it and get to the news of the day. It is Tuesday. And that means that there are, a couple of primaries going on. Most watched, I think, on this show has been Michigan. People are, I guess, we're closing out the voting. People have been voting for a long time. It's election day, per se. And if Donald Trump had his way, of course, this would be the only day that you voted, period. And actually, if he had his way, you wouldn't vote at all. There would be no Democratic primary. He would just say, it's a communist versus whoever we put up. And then you'd go and cast your ballots. But it wouldn't be today. It would be in November. So, yeah. Donald Trump doesn't even think today exists. That's how delusional this man is. All right. There's a couple of news stories about the crazy stuff that he said over the past day or two. I guess he had to do some traveling after all and flew on Air Force One and therefore had free-form time to babble to the press. I'm not even certain that any of those things landed in my Instapaper here. They're just, standard garbage things that he said along the way. There's much worse stuff being said, as it turns out. And I forgot. I sent out another. There was a very interesting comment that I wanted to chime in on, but also one terrible person who is running for Congress in Texas, of course. And, gee whiz, he's awful, and you should know about it. I'll tell you what I can about it, but this guy, the issue at the moment is I guess they're unearthing he's a YouTuber, and he's a gun YouTuber at that, and so that's never good. We may even have mentioned him on the air at some point, but not necessarily for this particular problem, but he's a YouTuber, so he, like me, has said things that he should probably regret, although mine are of a different sort entirely. This gun YouTuber who goes, I guess, online as the AK guy, as in AK-47. Why he didn't name himself after an American gun or even something, Western in general, I really have no idea. The San Antonio Current has covered the story. Michael Carlis wrote it up. I don't know. I just wanted to make you aware of the guy, but I'm not sure how to tell you the story. I could, of course, go with the censoring horn or something like it, but this is just like, there's cuss words, as Greg and I will sometimes drop as emphasis. And then there's just, straight up, basically, pornography language, I guess. And that's what the guy's talking, because he's a YouTuber and he thinks there's no rules. And now he's running for Congress because he thinks people, equate YouTube fame with you should be able to do whatever you want. We'll elect you to something. We need fighters. We don't need this kind of fighter, right? This isn't a Democrat either, of course. Brandon Herrera is the guy's name. And let's see. Most of what you need to know, I guess you could surmise from this photo of him from his 2024 failed congressional run. Was it 24 or was it earlier? In which he is, he's in that clasped hands, raised hands, together for victory kind of pose with Matt Gaetz, who, of course, is a filthy, disgusting pervert, as you know. And so, what else do you need to know? Anyway, there they are during his first run. I'll tell you, I guess we can come up with some sort of, I don't know. There's really nothing. There's no way to do it. But put it this way. He's in this unearthed video, he is denigrating the idea. I guess, is this during his race now? Because he's running against, the Democratic nominee is a woman and a local school teacher, former school teacher. And let's see, they're running for the district until recently held by now former U.S. Representative Tony Gonzalez. Okay. The red-leaning district includes a portion of western San Antonio along with a long swath of the U.S.-Mexican border. The Democrat here is Katie Padilla Stout. And I guess maybe we need to look into whether or not there's any way you can intervene in this race such that Brandon Herrera never makes it anywhere. But, it's a Republican-leaning district. He's, I guess, talking about, I don't know when the video was made, but it sounds like he's talking basically about mothers becoming, as a group, and as mothers, advocating politically, becoming politically active. Moms demand, right? So, he's a gun guy, and, by the way, the still from the video is absurd. It's, he's got he's got a t-shirt on that reads, you can see the top half of it, AK-47, but he's the AK guy. And then there's a wall behind him in which a pegboard, and he's put up, a couple dozen guns. I'm sure he's got hundreds. There's long rifles. I believe there's a grenade launcher visible, pistols, rifles, everything, big deal. Okay, he's got all his guns on display. Wow. Anyway, he's the basic of the message is, I don't have to give any special attention, and nobody should give any special attention to the political advocacy of moms as moms. Like, who cares that you're a mom? So he's basically, but in the rudest, most pornographic terms, come down to, like, if you're a mother, just because you had a child, and you have to think about, briefly, it doesn't take much, to think about how one goes about doing such a thing. How a woman becomes pregnant. This is a nice way of putting it, right? Well, just because you had that happen, or just because, to put more precision to it, just because you allowed a male partner to impregnate you in the way that happens, doesn't mean you have any special insight into anything. Of course, that's not what gives you a special insight into anything. It's the raising of the children and the perspective that comes with it, but that's, he doesn't care because I guess he's either got no children or just is a misogynist, and there's just no way women are going to be viewed as valuable or thinking beings in any way. They are, of course, receptacles for him, and that's all the only way to think of you. And you couldn't possibly have a political opinion worth hearing if you are just one of those receptacles. You get it? So anyway, Republican nominee for Congress. So put that one in your but tan suit files in terms of respect for public office in this country and who has it and who don't. Okay. That's it. He's unrepentant about it, and you ought to know that. I don't know how else to put this. And then we'll add a couple of censoring horn things and hopefully, I don't know, maybe there could be a miracle and we get to do this Bye Felicia that guy out forever. Chris Hayes reported that. Well, he picked up on this story from the San Antonio Current and did it on his show and just basically said, well, that was a first for the All In show. having to, read out the quote of it. I guess he was more straightforward about it than I'm willing to be. It's not good. There are people listening to this show that I don't want to have to, burn your ears out with something like this. Okay. The other thing I noticed this morning, which was of some interest, maybe I've been saying that we were aiming for political union for the longest time. When I say political union with Russia to own the globalists, something I say all the time on social media, somewhat tongue-in-cheek, but every once in a while there are concrete examples of this stuff. This one, perhaps we've been thinking about political union with the wrong country. Perhaps the Middle East is the country we're thinking of. I just happened to see, let's see, Greg Sargent. We'll trace the provenance of this thing. Greg Sargent posting on Blue Sky, don't miss this vile story. MAGA is raging at DHS chief Markwayne Mullin. He's already on the outs, everybody. Raging at Markwayne Mullin for admitting that migrant farm workers can benefit our economy. Well, obviously that's insane. That'll get you in trouble with the MAGA crowds. But of course, he's thinking, like I said, migrant farm workers. So we're really talking about crop picking, basically, and they're sort of basic to, the whole thing is sort of basic to getting you fed and keeping you alive. But never mind all of that. Deport all the people who bring food from farm to table. And, as John McCain pointed out years ago, you're not going to be able to, Americans aren't taking these jobs, and you couldn't do them if you wanted to. They are extraordinarily difficult jobs, literally back-breaking labor. But anyway, Markwayne Mullin, for some reason, decided to acknowledge reality. I don't know what he was thinking. He's like Jeanine Pirro in that respect. And yes, by the way, she is absolutely on the rocks. All the reporting today is that Trump is pondering firing her. I thought for a moment that she might have either been fired or resigned before the night was out. But so far, I haven't seen evidence of that. There was a couple of hints that made it sound that way, but I think people were just guessing. Go on Kalshi, I guess, and make your bet. Don't do that. Anyway, although if you are going to go on one of those prediction markets and make a bet, I would make a bet that Mitch McConnell dies next Tuesday night or Wednesday, once the deadline has passed for Andy Bashir to be able to call a special election. Exactly what everybody was speculating about a month ago, but they were trying to decide, could they hide his condition for a month before doing that? I mean, I don't actually know whether I believe that he's dead. It's interesting to think about, and it's kind of funny, except for, it involves somebody's death, which is not great, just in terms of karma and whatnot. But I do think it would be astonishing, let's say, if he were in fact alive and people were holding out hope, but he died anyway on or about the 11th, which I believe is the deadline. I mean, the conspiracy theories will be unending, and they will, I guess, deservedly so. It's just bizarre. Anyway, that wasn't what I wanted to tell you about. I wanted to tell you about Greg Sargent's comments about Markwayne Mullin admitting that migrant farm workers can benefit our economy. This means, he says, his devotion to ethnic cleansing is in doubt. He must be excommunicated. And he notes that he wrote about the collapse of MAGA mythology and provides a link. That's not where I'm going at the moment. Instead, I wanted to stop on this response from Mike Boylan Colchin to Greg Sargent. Mike is, an astrophysicist and a dog herder, so, a little bit of both. A professor of astronomy at the University of Texas in Austin, and he responds to Greg Sargent's comments saying, a lot of the MAGA crowd wants the U.S. to essentially become like the UAE. I was thinking Russia, but UAE. Why UAE? That's where there's an enormous foreign workforce who have substantially fewer rights than citizens and are subject to awful working conditions. It's a fever dream, but it's their fever dream. That may be right. And so I tried, in the few seconds I had before failing to start the show correctly, I was reminded of something that I had seen just a day or so ago from the Blue Sky poster Girl Futurist, who read a Boston Globe piece by Thomas Ricks and commented that Ricks had written in the Boston Globe piece. The Globe piece was titled, "With ICE, America is becoming the country we created in Iraq." That is, people getting shot in the street, jump squads, jumping out and kidnapping people off the street and disappearing them. You get the idea? And it's a good thought, scary thought. Thomas Ricks writes, well, can I get to the actual... he says, the beginning of his article, "Every time an immigration and customs enforcement agent kills a person in our streets, I think back to something that a Middle Easterner said just before the American invasion of Iraq, in 2003. And the quote was, 'You Americans think you are going to change us to be more like you,' he predicted. 'But I think the Middle East is going to change you to be more like us.'" I just thought that was interesting to read alongside the idea that, maybe our model for migrant farm workers will be the UAE, allowing them into the country, but only if they are herded into sheds overnight and kept there with little to no rights, and then kicked back out of the country the minute we don't need them anymore. It's a possibility. I guess if you're going to monitor the idea of political union with Russia, you can monitor the idea of political union with Arab, Persian Gulf, and Middle Eastern states. It's a thought. And meanwhile, then I cut and pasted the thing, and then everybody saw it and thought, that's a good comparison. I will mark that. And I missed the T somehow in the cut and paste of Thomas Ricks' first name. So Thomas Ricks, not hummus, but Thomas Ricks, apparently being quoted for that one. I was trying to find the right way to repost that. I wanted to give Girl Futurist the credit for, calling out that important quote. I could have just gone linked to the Thomas Ricks article and do it, but I didn't see it. Girl Futurist did. So it complicated things a little bit. Anyway, if you're following on Blue Sky as well as listening to the show, that's the explanation for calling the guy Thomas Ricks, but you probably also figured that out along the way. All right, other things to pull out of Instapaper. Some important, some not important. Yesterday I mentioned that I was upset with myself, and I really did obsess over this over the weekend. I was very annoyed that I didn't bring up the subject of Ceuta, the autonomous city that is said by Spain, anyway, to be Spanish territory. There are two exclaves, a word I had forgotten existed. I had called them enclaves, but as they are Spanish exclaves, but I guess Moroccans would think they were enclaves inside, right? Whereas they're exclaves to the Spanish. But Ceuta and I guess it's Melilla. It's Mellilla. And you know how the Spanish pronunciation of the double L's. Melilla is like 200 and something miles away to the east, also along the Moroccan coast. Essentially, I guess the Spanish just held on to these colonial remnants, port cities in Morocco. I'm not sure what they're doing with them right now, and I think they might be putting them to use largely as, well, shipping centers, but also as migrant clearing centers, and maybe an offshore place to send people who are picked up in the Mediterranean. The way we sometimes use Guantanamo as just sort of for offshoring people. But yeah, over the weekend it became a big deal. By Friday, the word was like there had been an enormous breach of the border fence, which was just overwhelmed. There were so many people at the fence that the guards and the fence couldn't hold them back, but also thousands upon thousands of people just trying to make a crossing by water or climbing over the very edge of the border fence, which was out on a bulkhead into the breakwater into the ocean, the sea, as the case may be. But enormous numbers of people trying to cross, but all at once, which gave the whole thing an air of, mystery. Where did this come from? Why is this happening? But in addition, some, dozens of people, 60 plus, drowned in the effort to reach it by water. It's difficult to understand exactly how this place is situated, but if you look on it on a map or look at the pictures that accompany some of the news articles, it quickly becomes clear. So extraordinarily dangerous. The Spanish authorities not entirely sure what triggered it, except they think that it might, or must, in their view, be attached to a recent Spanish Supreme Court ruling, which regarding immigration, but which really I think they meant to apply to people having reached the Spanish mainland, but that people, I guess, who attempted to reach it by water or were picked up on the way across the Mediterranean were to be, or not to be turned around and deported and sent back where they came from, but rather, I guess, brought into Spanish territory and then processed there. And the idea was that everybody then said, oh, so we got the idea, and sort of through a game of telephone, essentially, anybody who crosses into Spanish territory is home free. Now, what motivated tens of thousands of people all at once to try to do that in Ceuta, we're not sure.
Hi, Kagro in the Morning listeners. This is Rebecca Romans, longtime listener and longtime supporter of the show. Do you love your non-corporatized, completely independent, commercial-free Kagro in the Morning show? Do you stand out among the crowd at the office water cooler when discussing current events because of all the up-to-the-minute news you've been brought by David Waldman? Then it's time to give back a little. David relies on contributions from listeners like you and me to keep this show on the air. Patreon.com is among the easiest ways to make secure recurring monthly donations to support the show. Patreon.com/KagroX will bring you straight to his donation page, where you can sign up for any convenient tier you like. A mere $5 a month. You'll never miss it. Works out to about 25 cents a show. That means that David is making 12.5 cents an hour, which, by coincidence, is exactly what the GOP wants to lower the federal minimum wage to. Once again, David is ahead of the curve. If Patreon.com doesn't sound like your kind of thing, there's always PayPal, or even the Square Cash app. Any way you choose to donate, please choose to donate. And thank you on behalf of David and the rest of us listeners. Thank you very much.
All right, welcome back, everyone, to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Netroots Radio. All right, so we were in the middle of trying to figure out the situation in Ceuta and what we need to know about it, and reminding you that there's also another city, a couple hundred miles to the east, Melilla, similarly a weird remnant, I guess, of colonial days. Also, as I zoom in to Google Maps, and who knows whether you can trust Google Maps anymore. I guess just for just to check on it, I'll go over and see. Yeah, they are among the people who relabeled the Gulf of Mexico as the Gulf of America. So I don't know if you can necessarily take their word for it on these bodies of water. But as I was zooming in to the sea coast where Ceuta and Melilla are situated, it informs me that I guess what I would have thought was the Western Mediterranean, in fact, has its own name, but in a very small type here. I gotta zoom in and see if I can make it big enough to see. Alboran Sea? I don't believe I've ever run into the terminology for this. I always just figured it was, I guess it makes sense that, the Mediterranean, I think of more, of course, over towards Italy and Greece, in between Italy and Greece, and I guess that's where it is, and down to the coast of North Africa in the Tripoli area, and that the Western Mediterranean is actually a bunch of different smaller seas. Let's see. Tyrrhenian Sea. I don't even know how you pronounce it. Between Sardinia and Corsica and mainland Italy. And then, of course, this other area in between North Africa and the southern coast of Spain in the area of Gibraltar. I don't know. Okay, well, you learn something new every day, unless you already knew this. But if you knew this, you might have known about Ceuta and Melilla. Anyway, I just thought it was interesting, A, that those things existed, and B, the weird political twist that it gives to this entire situation. So, unknown is what made it so popular so quickly for so many thousands of people to try to do this. And in many cases, the newspaper coverage in the last couple of days made it seem like the people who crossed, only some of them were in fact migrants from elsewhere in Africa who were making genuine attempts to escape, for whatever reason, to Spanish territory, to European sovereign territory, and pursue a permanent resettlement in Europe, and that some considerable number of the people who made the crossing were in fact Moroccans who just, I don't know, I mean, it's almost as if they thought of it as a lark in some way, and they mostly got to Ceuta and marched around and celebrated, and then were asked to go back and did. But if you made the crossing by water, apparently it was so dangerous that you wonder, could that possibly really just have been a lark? But I guess some people who entered into the water really should have not have done that and really had no serious hope of being able to make this crossing. Others, I guess, were much more adept at it, and it really was something that they could do for lark. And then I'm sure some people got, trampled or fell down or otherwise encountered some extraordinary difficulty. It's difficult to picture the whole thing happening, but Ceuta is situated on a little peninsula right in the Gibraltar area. As I said, Melilla is a couple hundred miles to the east and is more say south of central Spanish coast, east of Malaga, maybe due south of Granada, which is which is not coastal, but is the biggest recognizable city, I suppose, of the Spanish South. Just that it happens to be, situated correctly longitudinally. Anyway, so it's difficult to kind of understand, like, if it's attached to land, like, how come you have to swim to it? There's a fence in the way. Well, why don't you just go around the end of the fence? I don't know. I guess they've thought of that already, maybe, the Spanish, and trying to keep hold of this. So I guess there are some places where you can, jump off into the water from unfenced Moroccan territory and make a swim across a small but rather open bay, and so that's difficult to do. But apparently it's a mile or two in crossing, so that accounts for the difficulty people were having. Anyway, what motivated everybody to do it all at once? There was, of course, that was true that there was the Spanish Supreme Court decision. Not entirely clear that the Supreme Court meant for this to actually apply to exclaves like Ceuta, but rather to arrivals or people headed for the Spanish mainland, the Spanish Main, if you will, whether they be pirates or migrants or both. Anyway, so there's been some speculation about what might have driven people to decide all at once that they were going to do this, and thousands of them. And it comes from Al Jazeera, which, has its own bent, and so they're going to land on this certain part of the question and the certain kind of explanation for what might have driven it. My own speculation on the situation, though, I don't think I put a motive to it more than I did to ask. I wondered, as Trump picked up on it, late Friday afternoon, he started commenting on it, and that is when I knew I had made a mistake by not telling you about it. At that point, it was just headlines, tens of thousands of people crossing over into Ceuta, and I was fascinated by the existence of Ceuta first and foremost. Thought I would tell you about it. By the afternoon, Trump had decided that, of course, the breach of the border was the fault of, in his view, the radical left-wing, crazy communist socialist government in Spain, with whom he has wrangled a lot in the last couple of weeks and months. The Spanish denying, all sorts of use of their airspace or refueling stations or ports for the Iran operation, denouncing it as unnecessary aggression, refusing to help out in its prosecution, and various other places in which they've parted ways with the United States, up to and including the stance on the situation in Israel and Gaza. They're very stridently pro-Palestinian in the Gaza issue, the war, as everybody, as I think, pretty much the rest of the world landing there too, but rather more stridently than most of the rest of Western Europe, I guess. And of course, socialist government, and Trump loves to use them as a punching bag and a target, and saying that this whole thing was their fault somehow. And there were some people online who were willing to align with that. This is due to the socialist government there, although, again, our leftist government. And it occurred to me that hanging on to exclaves like this, these colonial remnants, doesn't usually align with the socialist agenda per se, but my guess is that they've been saddled with these things for a very long time, and it's now become a point of Spanish national pride, at least among the right wing, and you would be viewed as, and portrayed as some sort of a traitor if you said, these are really troublesome and irreconcilable with our foreign policy in general and ought to be repatriated to the Moroccans. But, that's a difficult thing to do in a country that's probably, for whatever reason, partial to hanging on to these colonial remnants. But that's what they are. But they do complicate the situation somewhat in that the Spanish position on Gaza is that this is horrific abuse, and I don't know if you want to pull out the genocide terminology and insist that the word be said, we can say it. You can debate whether or not it belongs there on your own time, but okay. But the issue is, if the Spanish condemnation of Israeli occupation of other people's territory is to have any real force, it becomes more and more difficult to do that if you are also holding on to what really, honestly, I think if anybody looks at a map, is Moroccan territory. Morocco doesn't recognize it as Spanish territory. It's just fenced off and defended. But, in their view, no, that's Moroccan territory. See also during the recent World Cup playoffs, the Falkland Islands / Maldives. Is it Maldives? No. What are they? The Maldives is a different country entirely. What do they call it? Las Malvinas. That's it. It's not the Maldives, but the Malvinas Islands. Sorry about that, Maldives. You're your own place on the other side of the world. Anyhow, it becomes difficult to defend, let's say, holding on to Ceuta and Melilla when you are criticizing Israel for its occupation of Gaza and the West Bank, and I guess, keep going, right? Golan Heights, southern Lebanon, etc. I don't think they're qualitatively the same, but they are occupation. Like, there's no, as far as I know, no accusation that of genocide against the Spanish in Ceuta or Melilla. So, I don't know what kind of genocide they might have perpetrated in order to capture those cities in the first place, but that's a bit further in the past. And the idea, though, of saddling the current Spanish socialist government with, well, it's your fault that you even have these places. Ceuta, as I understand, has been a Spanish possession since the 1500s, and I think it goes back even earlier, and there's a weird provenance of all this. I believe it was Portuguese originally, and then there was a unification of the crowns of Portugal and Spain for a while, and then when Portugal regained its independence from the Spanish crown, the colony went with Spain, and then since, 1580 something, the city has been Spanish. So it's not exactly the current Spanish government's idea to hold on to, and it's not exactly a left-wing idea to hold on to those kinds of exclaves in the first place. Anyway, that's a pretty right-wing idea, to claim them, to hold them, to keep them. But it does complicate things, and Al Jazeera points out more complications than just that. I thought this was kind of an interesting combination of why did this happen the way it happened, and what are the politics. We'll also throw in there, by the way, that at the same time that Spain is rightfully raising its voice about the situation in Gaza, they have for however many years it's been, however many hundreds of years this has been going on, raising their voice in complaint about the continuing British occupation of Gibraltar. So between their complaints about Gibraltar and Gaza, these are illegal foreign occupations. They go as far as they can in light of their own continued occupation of Ceuta and Melilla. Anyway, the explainer offered by Al Jazeera, written by, where's the byline in Al Jazeera? Alex Milan Duri. This is, of course, Al Jazeera in English. Couldn't read you the original Al Jazeera. It's in Arabic. Why did Ceuta migrant mayhem chill already frosty Israel-Spain relations? Over to the other side of the triangle here. Israel-Spain relationships. What caused more than 50,000 migrants to storm a Spanish enclave, it's an exclave, in Africa? And did Israel have anything to do with it? What? Well, if you're Al Jazeera, you might ask that question. And there's something to it. It just seems like maybe a distraction from some other major problems that they'd probably rather be spending time on. But here's the deal. Spain says the crisis in its North African enclave Ceuta is back under control, with most of the more than 50,000 migrants who stormed across its borders over recent days choosing to voluntarily go back to Morocco. Tens of thousands of people crossed into Ceuta on Thursday and continued arriving overnight into Friday. So, and I guess that's the brief picture I get of this idea of people voluntarily going back to Morocco. Between that and video I saw of people just basically goofing around in weird ways, marching around in Ceuta in their bathing suits because that's what they swam across the bay in, and then, banging pots and pans or rocks or whatever together and then being asked to leave, and fine. We were just here to prove a point, but you might wonder what would make anybody do that. So, let's see. There are a couple other stories related here that, so 57 dead after 60,000 breached the border in Morocco to get to Ceuta. Okay, anyway, back to the story, the narrative of it. Most came by sea, swimming or in small boats to get around the border fence. Some rushed border crossing points in such numbers that the guards were overwhelmed. Others tried to climb the breakwater that holds the border fence. At least 67 people died trying to reach Ceuta. For some reason it said 57 up here, but now it's 67. Many questions remain about what caused such a huge number of people to abruptly seek to illegally enter Spanish territory. It was clearly not a coincidence they all chose the same day to do so. Now the question, was it coordinated and planned in advance? And if so, by whom and for what purpose? Here's what we know, or at least what Al Jazeera says they know. Where is Ceuta and why is it significant? You know this part. It's an autonomous Spanish city on the northern coast of Africa bordering Morocco, along with Melilla. It is one of the only two land borders. It is one of the only two land borders between the European Union and Africa. It first came under Portuguese rule in 1415. That's a while ago. Before becoming part of Spain in 1580. It remained under Spanish sovereignty after Portugal regained independence in 1640. After the decolonization of Africa, Ceuta and Melilla are the only remaining European-held territories on the African mainland. Its location has made it one of the main entry points for migrants and asylum seekers trying to reach Europe. The enclave is protected by high border fences, which I guess don't work apparently. Note to the Trump administration. Trump won. Surveillance systems, and a permanent deployment of Spain's civil guard and national police. Isn't it interesting, though, as I was saying, as Trump was saying, well, clearly this is the fault of the Spanish leftist socialist government. They're too weak to protect their borders. Whereas, on the other hand, you could easily look at this and say, hey, maybe border fences don't work if there are enough people determined enough to get across. So, of course, that could not possibly be the lesson because Orange Idiot would never have it. Now, what caused the sudden massive influx? Authorities in Ceuta linked the surge in attempted crossings to a Spanish Supreme Court ruling published in July that barred authorities from immediately returning migrants who arrive by sea. Maybe that accounted for the large number of people who opted to arrive by sea here, or maybe that was just the only way they could think of to get around. The ruling does not apply to migrants who enter Spain by land, including by climbing over the border fence. But several experts have questioned this theory, saying few migrants would have been aware of the court ruling. Possibly. Ignacio Sembrero, not sombrero, but sembrero with a C and an E. Ignacio Sembrero, a Spanish journalist specialized in migration in North Africa, told the news agency AFP, the French, that, quote, without a doubt, the July 8th ruling has played a role, but that doesn't explain the level of mobilization. It doesn't, and it doesn't explain the timing either. July 8th ruling, and then July 28th, they start making for the border all at once. Spanish Prime Minister Pedro Sanchez, and I know every time I hear that, I was like, is that a joke? Are you kidding? The guy's name is, it's a common name, but it's the kind of name that someone like Trump, if he had no idea who the Spanish Prime Minister was, he'd say, I don't know, Pedro Sanchez, and you'd think he was a racist. But no, he's right. What can I tell you? Well, Pedro Sanchez blamed the sudden influx on human trafficking mafias who exaggerated the significance of the court ruling to convince vast numbers of migrants to take part in a mass-coordinated surge into Ceuta, although it's not clear to me, to what end. But, human trafficking mafias, I don't know, they sound like jerks. Maybe they would have done something like this. I just don't know why. It seems to me like they wouldn't waste effort on something pointless, to make a political point. I don't think the mafias are too much into that. But something else that I haven't understood, maybe. Some believe that Morocco may have had a role in organizing and facilitating the sudden mass breach of the border themselves. Morocco, you see, does not recognize Madrid's sovereignty over the centuries-old Spanish enclaves Ceuta and Melilla, regarding them as occupied territory. And that's a phrase that carries some weight in Al Jazeera and elsewhere. Morocco also stridently asserts its own sovereignty over, this is where it really starts to get complicated. The Africa part of this thing is quite complicated itself, never mind getting to the Israel part. Morocco also stridently asserts its own sovereignty over Western Sahara. Look on the map. You should take a look at it. I've looked at it a couple of times on the map, mostly because I was looking at the fabulous resort islands off the coast of Morocco and Western Sahara, and then looking at how barren and impoverished Western Sahara is. And even what is even Western Sahara? It's an open question. Independent country, colonial holdover, no longer. Part of Morocco, not quite. Interesting. And I once thought that might make a good subject for a day's attention on the show, but I couldn't justify it until now. Anyway, Morocco asserts its own sovereignty over Western Sahara, a former Spanish colony that Morocco, annexed in 1975, where the indigenous inhabitants, represented by the Polisario Front, oppose rule from Rabat, the capital of Morocco, and want independence. In April of 2021, Madrid allowed Polisario Front leader Brahim Ghali, Ghali, to be treated in a Spanish hospital for COVID-19, by the way, infuriating Morocco, which regards him as a criminal in charge of an outlawed separatist rebellion. And it is a fascinating thing, by the way. Also, you should, I guess, if you start looking on Google Maps, if you can trust them, you can see how fluid the border between Western Sahara and Morocco and other surrounding countries is. They're just these vast sections of unpopulated desert territory that I guess it makes sense that no one would know exactly where the border is. But there's a lot of disputes. And certain groups claim the borders are here, there, and elsewhere. It's really, quite a mess, as you can imagine. Morocco recalled its ambassador from Madrid and appeared to loosen its border controls in May, allowing about 10,000 migrants to enter Ceuta as a threat to Spain. So that sets the table for all of this. In 2022, Spain restored full diplomatic relations with Morocco after reversing its 4-decade policy of supporting self-determination for the indigenous people of Western Sahara and instead backing Moroccan sovereignty. So that's an interesting twist too, right? So they decolonize Africa, the rest of Europe. 75, they remove themselves from Morocco and Western Sahara in particular and say, Western Sahara we regard as separate. And maybe, I guess, I don't know whether the whole time they regarded them as separate and that the indigenous people of Western Sahara should be separate from Morocco, or whether that came a few years after, because it sounded like earlier when they decolonized, they just said, we cede this territory to Morocco. Then at some point, maybe they changed their mind and said, no, there's a claim of indigenous people for independence, and we now back that. So 4 decades of that kept them on the outs with Morocco, and then they finally reversed themselves recently and said maybe it would be best if Morocco took sovereignty over Western Sahara. Interesting, because I think they are slated to, are they hosting the next, or is it the next after the next World Cup across the Iberian Peninsula and down into Morocco? So they're going to have some closer coordination in order to make that work, as I recall. Anyway, last month, where were we here? Yes, they've reversed their 4-decade-long policy, now backing Moroccan sovereignty over Western Sahara. It was widely assumed that Rabat achieved this goal by leveraging the vulnerability of the Spanish exclaves. They say enclaves. Maybe I've got that wrong. I just thought exclave was an interesting word when somebody corrected me. Maybe they were wrong. Maybe they are enclaves. I don't know. Sounds like they're right, though, exclaves. The last month, relations between Madrid and Rabat soured again, though, because Sanchez made an official visit to Algeria. Algeria? Dramatic music. Well, yeah, that's a problem that you would know about if you were Moroccan, I guess, but we don't. What's the problem? Algeria is a country that Morocco regards as a bitter enemy because of its unwavering support for the Polisario Front down in Western Sahara. And, borders are shared, so they have some interest in this. Morocco, I'm sort of looking over at the map here. Algeria has got a tiny, tiny border with Western Sahara, but a long border with Morocco. And I guess I could see them trying to exert some influence in who would be in control of the Western Sahara, even though it's only the smallest of borders with them. Anyway, continuing on here, some are speculating that the latest events in Ceuta show Morocco once again sending a warning to Spain. Now, what does all this have to do with Israel? Well, we got a minute or two to talk about that. Some observers believe that if Morocco did orchestrate the mayhem, it may have been encouraged by others, pointing at 2 leaders with a particular grudge against Sanchez. Ready for this one? The first one is far too dumb to do something like this. U.S. President Donald Trump. He doesn't know that there is a Ceuta. And the other, well, maybe, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, which seems far-fetched, but again, you're reading Al Jazeera, So maybe. I mean, they're gonna put this theory forward. Not that it's right. It's Al Jazeera. Sanchez is one of Europe's most consistently pro-Palestinian voices. He has explicitly said Israel's war on Gaza is genocide. He has been highly critical of the U.S.-Israel war on Iran and refused to allow jointly operated U.S.-Spanish military facilities to be used to facilitate that war. Trump has been scathing about Spain because of its refusal to spend a greater share of gross domestic product to match the NATO target. Morocco has been far friendlier to Spain than Spain. Morocco has been far friendlier than Spain to Israel. In 2024, Spain refused to allow a U.S.-flagged cargo ship carrying weapons for Israel to dock at, Algeciras. I guess is that a Spanish port? And it sounds an awful lot like Al Jazeera. Algeciras. Algeciras. So, the vessel redirected to Morocco instead. That same year, Moroccan authorities allowed an Israeli warship to dock at Tangier to refuel and resupply en route from the U.S. to Israel after Spain had refused the vessel port access. Many Israelis consider Madrid's support for Palestine to be hypocritical when Spain also occupies Arab territory, Ceuta and Melilla, right? That's pretty interesting. But how seriously is it taken in Israel? I don't know. But in 2019, Netanyahu's son Yair tweeted a map of Ceuta and Melilla saying, "Dear Arabs and Muslims, want to free occupied Islamic lands? Here's a good start." Yeah, well, that meddling, I'm sure, was unappreciated. We'll be right back to talk more about it in a minute. All right, welcome back, everybody, to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Netroots Radio. We're in the middle of Al Jazeera's article about I don't know if you need a conspiracy to think about this. I guess it's a conspiracy, though, if you believe that Israel was somehow in on instigating tens of thousands of Moroccans and other Africans to charge the border at Ceuta. But, as they were pointing out, there are two national leaders who would have a particular interest in, let's say, instigating something with Spain because they have a grudge against their current Prime Minister, Pedro Sanchez. One was President Trump, who I find it very difficult to believe knew that there was a Ceuta before Friday. And I'm not even sure that he knew what he was talking about when he spoke about Ceuta on Friday, because he also, I think part of his comments made it sound like he either was intentionally conflating Ceuta as Spanish territory with mainland Spain. I think he also got mixed up about North Africa and Spain and said that Ceuta was in northern Spain, which wouldn't make any sense at all. But, that could be a slip of the tongue or just, his orange dementia. I don't know what. But it's very difficult to believe that Trump would have planned such an event, given that it's almost impossible to believe that he knew that there was a Ceuta. Not just because I didn't know there was a Ceuta, but that does help compound things, if you want to be honest. Then I guess the next question is, well, why would the Israelis do it? Wouldn't it be likely that the Israelis would be just as ignorant of Ceuta and Melilla as the rest of us? They're not close, right? And they got their own parochial issues to worry about. Except, I guess, one piece of evidence here is that, at a minimum, in 2019, Benjamin Netanyahu's son Yair was, in fact, aware of the ironic situation represented by the existence of Ceuta and Melilla as exclaves. So, they do know. That's on the record. So there, maybe. Is that enough? Well, I don't know. Let's see what the rest of the article says. In March of this year, an article written by American Enterprise Institute fellow Michael Rubin for the staunchly pro-Israel Middle East Forum urged Moroccans should gather, send bulldozers to the border, and then enter Ceuta and Melilla unarmed to raise the flag, which one, I guess, puts at least one American on record as knowing about the existence of Ceuta and Melilla, and I'm sure there are more. Think tank guys would know. Donald Trump would probably not. Interesting, though, for the American Enterprise Institute is right wing, and of course, I assume the staunchly pro-Israel Middle East Forum also likely pretty right wing, although there's plenty of staunchly, if it's simply pro-Israel, there's certainly plenty of left-leaning, staunchly pro-Israel people, even if they are upset about Gaza. But the idea that American right-wing think tank people would be advocating, oddly enough, the idea of people on the let's say the poorer side of the border showing up with bulldozers and just bashing their way across the border, but then unarmed, but then raising the flag. It's unusual, and you wouldn't see them advocating that Mexicans do it, for instance. But when it falls on others, they're perfectly happy to do so. And I guess the insinuation here is that Michael Rubin, because of his staunchly pro-Israel sympathies, I guess, because his writing for the Middle East Forum, was just looking to impose an L on Spain. I guess that's possible. In April, pro-Israel Moroccan analyst Amine Ayoub, okay, again, pro-Israel Moroccan. Yes, they exist. In fact, there's lots of them, and you'll hear more about that in the coming paragraphs. Wrote an article for Israeli website Ynet News. And as I recall, the Ynet News site is a left-leaning Israeli outlet that likewise has been pretty critical of Gaza, the conduct of the Gaza war, etc., and the Israeli government in general. But yeah, okay, so that's how this is a pro-Israel Moroccan analyst writing in Ynet News, and I guess that maybe the left-leaning aspect of Ynet News that's of importance here is they would probably accept the submission from a Moroccan analyst, pro-Israel or not, whereas the right-wing Israeli publications would say, what do we want to hear from a Moroccan analyst for? Anyway, he wrote, she, I don't even know, Amine Ayoub. Well, we could look that up, I suppose. But more to the point, the substance of the article. U.S.-Spain tensions over NATO and Iran, I guess, create, this must be the headline, U.S.-Spain tensions over NATO, Iran, create opening for Morocco to press claims on Ceuta and Melilla, with Israel positioned to back Rabat diplomatically within the U.S.-led alliance that increasingly favors cooperative partners over European holdouts. I know, that's a little bit convoluted to try and figure out here. And I might be able to get, I'm now looking at the article in Ynet News, and we might be able to get a look at whether or not, or some hint about if it's important, Amine Ayoub's gender. I just want to get it right. Okay, I said he could be, I don't recognize the name, but it appears as a male-presenting person, so we'll just go with that. Got it? Okay. On Friday, with Ceuta invaded by, and that's a loaded term, but it's Al Jazeera's term, invaded by tens of thousands of migrants, Israel's ambassador to the United Nations, Danny Danon, perhaps, it's not two N's like the yogurt. Well, it is two N's, not three N's like the yogurt. But Danny Danon, I guess, D-A-N-O-N, posted a provocative comment on X. That's sure to help things. Spain, which never misses an opportunity to lecture Israel, has declared a state of emergency in Ceuta following the crisis over its immigration policy. Danon wrote, maybe before it continues lecturing us, it's time it explained to the world why it still maintains colonial enclaves in Africa. A good question, not on a par with why are you killing tens of thousands of people in Gaza, but it is a good question. Why do they? And I did wonder about this. My first reaction to the whole issue, and upon A, finding out that those exclaves existed, and B, that this crisis was occurring, like, what are you doing holding on to this? And what did you really think was going to happen in maintaining a totally artificial and entirely unsupportable land border with Africa, knowing what, the continuing migration issues going on? Like, of course, these two cities are going to be besieged. And you've known that for a long time, and that's why they're fortified. But, like, you're just inviting the problem by continuing to hold on to things. I'm wondering, like, I'm assuming that there's some financial benefit, not just nationalistic, that goes into it, but I'm sure it's extraordinarily expensive to maintain, and really, honestly, probably counterproductive. But yes, you should absolutely expect that this is going to happen if you're going to tease desperate migrants with this weird technicality that nothing but a chain link fence or, hey, make it a cement border. It doesn't really matter. Nothing but this wall and this artificial line stopping you from technically making it to Europe. So, why not try? Of course they're going to try and do this. And if you're going to try and hold on to this thing because of the continuing influence of right-wing politics, even in a country that's elected a socialist government, you are going to have these problems. Comparing it to mass killings and genocide, well, that's not going to do it. But it does raise questions. Well, it's starting to become quite clear, commented Spain's transport minister, Oscar Puente, apparently suggesting that he thought Israel was involved in what happened in Ceuta, because, of course, they're taking advantage of the fact that this thing happened to score some cheap political points, but it doesn't, say to me, oh, yes, well, the reason they're scoring the cheap political points is that they knew they were going to have that opportunity a week ago when they arranged this thing. I think it's perfectly plausible that they just took advantage of the fact that it actually happened. But there's still the question of why all at once? That's a good question, although it may be explainable entirely by the fact that viral videos, the way they work, essentially it was a gigantic flash mob assembled at the behest of some one or set of TikTok type, social media videos. The question is, who made them, and were they generated by someone other than, an individual with this weird idea that caught fire? Was it organized by or backed by some larger organization? I guess we still just don't know. Now, other background information that's worth having, and it'll help clarify this: pro-Israel sentiment has been steadily on the rise in Morocco, particularly as the country's diplomatic relationship with both Israel and the United States has been deepening. Days ago, it was announced that Morocco named a 1,055-kilometer highway, that's 655.5 miles, by the way, 650-mile highway over Western Sahara, right? Morocco built it and named it after Trump. What in the world are they doing, naming a highway in maybe not even their own country after Donald Trump? Well, looking to impress him and not wanting to spend the money on a gold brick, I guess. Experts said the gesture was far from surprising, though, as Morocco was one of the signatories to the Trump-brokered Abraham Accords, which saw the country normalize relations with Israel in 2020. Not that they are close to one another, but I guess they figured, what the hell, we'll sign. We have no particular border tensions with Israel, not likely to end up in any sort of a conflict with Israel. We can get money from the Americans and gain influence and, flatter Trump by signing this thing. Sure, let's go ahead and do it. If the path is cleared by other closer to Israel and more militantly Arab Islamic countries that, along the lines of, the other signatories. I think Saudi Arabia has not, but Trump is pressuring them to do so. But UAE, Oman, Qatar, Bahrain, I think, those, I don't even know if all of them actually signed that. But Anyway, I haven't paid that much attention to the Abraham Accords, but apparently Morocco is in on it. Trump, of course, thinks it's a major, foreign policy coup and ushering in a new era of peace in the Middle East, right in the middle of gigantic wars and an expanding one that we're fighting next door. Not in the Middle East, technically, but okay. Close enough. Anyway, there is no evidence that, did we skip over this? Yeah, they signed the Abraham Accords. In return, the Trump administration has provided crucial support to Morocco at the United Nations and through bilateral channels. And why is that important? Because it brings Rabat closer to securing greater control over Western Sahara. There is no evidence that Morocco orchestrated events in Ceuta, partly on behalf of Israel, just a lot of interesting coincidences. That's the out that Al Jazeera is taking here. But whether or not there was any conspiracy, one consequence of the episode is clear. The already frosty relations between the left-wing Spanish government of Sanchez and the far-right Israeli government of Netanyahu are now even chillier. Okay, so I don't know. I don't think we were going to stumble on that background information all by ourselves there. So it was worth giving it a second look. All right. Other things that need discussing. I got to scroll down here and get to this. This has been sitting in my Instapaper for some time, and it's time to brag on ourselves here and talk about what a fantastic show this is. How about that? And this is something you can use to go out, and you should all be doing this, evangelizing the show to others and try and bring friends with you to listen and subscribe and bolster the subscriber base here and really try to help us grow the show in meaningful ways. And this is the reason people ought to want to be interested in it. And it goes something like this. I'm looking at a opinion essay, a guest essay, by, now that I remember who wrote this piece, and say I'm going to advertise the show and bolster our credentials on it. And now I realize, oh yeah, right, I didn't want to do that because it's Jeffrey Toobin. Oh well. But the point is, this is the Jeffrey Toobin who's not on a Zoom conference right now. You don't want to get on one with him, but everybody remembers Jeffrey Toobin and, I don't know, his COVID-era psychosis about how to conduct himself on a Zoom call. And that's all terrible. But set it aside, because Jeffrey Toobin still sometimes thinks good thoughts. And we hope that it's the majority of his time is spent on those thoughts and not the Zoom call type thoughts. Anywho, this is important because of the substance of it. He asks the question, or at least they give him the headline, what's the worst thing Trump can do in the midterms? And, of course, the worst thing he can do in the midterms is murder all the Democrats. But I think he's thinking more practically. This is, though, an exposition on how far could Republicans go in maneuvering under the rules, or even outside of the rules, in Congress to retain control, or at least nominally retain control, if they lose the elections. This has been the subject of much speculation, and a lot of speculation that I think ultimately may land in the right place, but can't explain how it gets there when it's confronted by so-called realists who point out, I think, incorrectly, that this would be impossible to do because XYZ, and we'll get to the XYZ, when in fact the XYZ doesn't stand as starkly in black and white in real life as they imagine. What we're talking about here is the House of Representatives, and if there was a majority Democratic House of Representatives elected this November, could Republicans manage something that would keep control, at least nominally and temporarily, in their hands, despite the election results, and even despite acknowledging that those appear to be the election results in front of everybody, but still somehow hold on to power. And the last time I recall this being discussed in depth was January of this year, when some speculated that this was possible, and I, in fact, joined them in speculating that it is possible. But as I recall at the time, like there were many people, but the standout name for this one, Jamel Bowie on Blue Sky, and I don't think he sat down and wrote and researched and reached a conclusion. It was just his general thinking. I don't fault him for it. It's very difficult to know what you need to know and analyze it the way you need to analyze it to end up where I did. But it seems pretty obvious once you get past it all. But he was saying, no, all of you don't understand how this works, and that was very familiar. Like the filibuster nuclear option materials for years. That's not how it works. You can't just change the rules by majority vote. Yes, you can. You're all actually wrong. That was very difficult for a lot of people to swallow. But here was another one. You don't understand. That's not how this works. On January 3rd, 2027, all the terms of every member of Congress, Republican and Democrat alike, very definitively, constitutionally, come to an end. The entirety of the House of Representatives is renewed every 2 years. People love to pull out. You see, the House, unlike the Senate, is not what you would call a quote-unquote continuing body. Well, that's all true. But they then went on to say, so that's impossible. If you elect a majority of Democrats, on January 3rd at noon, the House becomes a majority Democrat. So if Republicans from the old Congress wanted to block Democrats from the new Congress from taking over, and they tried to do so using the rules and their powers as the current majority, they would no longer be permitted to do so because they don't hold that majority any longer, you see, and so therefore it's impossible. But it's not. And Jeffrey Toobin takes a stab at explaining why that is the case and will elaborate if necessary. But I think he kind of makes the point. My point is that he's making this point on July 27th, 2026, whereas this was a point that I made probably on the show and on Blue Sky around January 5th or 6th of this year. And we got the Blue Sky posts to prove it. Jamel Bowie did not engage with it, but, he's a busy guy. So here's Toobin's telling of it from the 27th of last month. There's a macabre parlor game obsessing many Democrats because they assume that President Trump will be unconstrained by law, ethics, tradition, and precedent in trying to preserve the Republican majorities in Congress. They're asking, what's the worst he can do to fix this year's midterm elections? No idea, no matter how far-fetched, is off limits. He recognizes the limitations of this theory. The tepid response to Mr. Trump's address this month about election vulnerabilities, remember that flopped thing that he did in prime time that he couldn't get anyone to cover, and it was just, his election stump speech complaints? Well, it showed that he's had only mixed success in his campaign so far. He's failed to persuade the Senate to pass the Save America Act, which would impose onerous new rules for proof of citizenship on voters, and a federal judge has put on hold his directive to the Postal Service to limit delivery of mail-in ballots in states that refuse to share voter data with the federal government. But the very fact that Mr. Trump decided to give a high-profile speech underlined his obsessive interest in the subject, and he continues to use the many other tools at his disposal to further this aim, including threatening to withhold federal funding from states that refuse to follow his directives on voting, and neutralizing the bipartisan agency devoted to helping administer fair elections. That'd be the Federal Elections Commission, but also what's the actual name of the bureau that actually, the Voting Assistance Bureau that helps administer rules and makes grants to states to run the elections, etc. So, but I think he was thinking of that and not the Federal Election Commission, which is also paralyzed and used to be a bipartisan agency. But what else could Mr. Trump do? That's the real aim of things. That's just about the only thing Representative Joe Morell thinks about these days. Oh, well, good. Somebody's thinking about it. People, were open to the idea of the nuclear option and wanted to consider it beforehand, and they ended up being thought leaders on it when they opened their mind to the possibility that it was real. All right, Well, Joe Morell, has represented a district in upstate New York since 2018, and he serves as the ranking member on the House Administration Committee, which supervises federal elections and oversight of House officers and operates unofficially as a kind of nerd caucus for those members who aspire to mastery of the House's arcane rules and traditions. The president simply can't get over 2020, he says, and he's reliving it every day. I feel like it's the girlfriend in high school that got away, Mr. Morell told me. I see. Not the best analogy, but okay. Instead of accepting the fact that he lost an election, God forbid, which most everybody does if you're in this business long enough, he just attacks the system. Mr. Morell has been traveling the country, Los Angeles, San Francisco, that's just one state so far. Dallas, okay, that's Texas, with more on the horizon. I wouldn't even really classify that as traveling the country, except he's from New York. Holding hearings about the risks to the vote, in particular for this year's midterm. So if he's holding field hearings, I guess that counts as traveling the country. While most of the attention so far has focused on who gets to register and vote, Mr. Morell has also been noodling about what happens after the votes are cast on November 3rd. And that was the part that Jamel was leaving out of the analysis. The pure mechanics of how transfers of power and how transitions between Congresses are made and who is out and who's not out on January 3rd at noon. Okay. The process for installing a new House of Representatives begins when the states certify the results in each of the 435 races. The rules vary by state, but most require election officials to certify by late November or early December. In other words, they send their certification results to Congress, and Congress does some mysterious thing with them, which, for some reason, believers in the Jamel Bowie line of thinking in this one, I think are like self-executing, even though they're quite well versed in pointing out the number of other things, that is to say, everything in the whole world is not self-executing. Very little is self-executing under our system, and you got to make it happen. And they just haven't done any thinking about how that does happen. In recent years, Trump-aligned local officials have frequently used false claims of fraud or non-citizens voting as justification to decline to certify election results. There's that, yes. Since 2020, more than 30 local officials in Arizona, Colorado, Georgia, Michigan, New Mexico, North Carolina, and Pennsylvania have refused to certify election results, many in hopes of forestalling Democratic victory. So that's one way you could do it, right? The certifications have to arrive in, by the way, where do they go? To the clerk of the House of Representatives. That's an important place, and important for reasons we've explained before, and you'll hear more about them. But what if those certifications don't arrive? That's the first place that this can go south. If there are similar delays and refusals after November 3rd, and there probably will be, Mr. Morell has a simple answer: sue. In past years, Democrats have had success in winning court rulings that force local officials to certify results, and they'll probably win these kinds of cases again, albeit with the unusual delays and uncertainty that always accompany litigation. And here I would remind you of how long did it take to get Al Franken seated in the Senate, right? It was, everybody knew that he had won, and eventually Republicans lost in their bid to disallow him from replacing Norm. Crap! I had it at the tip of my tongue, and I already then blanked on his name again. But at any rate, the point is they delayed and delayed and delayed, and yes, Franken was eventually seated, but they took every advantage in delaying his seating, and it screwed with things legislatively. You only have to know about the history of the passage of the Affordable Care Act to think about that, and it was a very difficult and damaging litigation that they conducted, knowing that they were going to eventually lose. Anyway, Yes, it's true that Democrats would eventually likely win that litigation, but in the meantime, would they be able to govern? And if not, who would be governing? How many Democrats will have their credentials questioned? That's one part, but it's only one part of this plan. We'll get to the second part of it after this 2-minute break. See if you can remember in the meantime what that argument is about.
Sup fam, it's your boy Darwin, aka Darwin_Darko, aka the most reasonable man in America, aka KITM's senior black correspondent. You might remember me from such recordings as Spacemen versus Space Cadets and We Need to Talk About Joe Biden. Today, I want to bring you good news about that thing you've been struggling with. Do you suffer from giving too much of a damn? Do you turn on the series of tubes and find yourself outraged at the particular way some news organization strung some sentences together only to realize, nope, this is not some fictional hellscape? Well, guess what? You no longer have to accept the life of giving too much of a damn. You can do something about it, because even you, yes you, can be a show contributor. Now I know what you're thinking. Hey, Mr. Most Reasonable Man in America, I'm not some professional podcast talking guy. Don't worry about it. Do you have a smartphone or some other electronic recording device? Well, that's all you need. You too can have a segment where you can read us an important article and give us your take. Read one of your own original essays, or even just give us your commentary on something you'd like to share that's important to you. Fair warning though, side effects may include general punditry, having opinions and hot takes, getting stuff off your chest, and hearing your own voice. If your recording lasts longer than 5 to 7 minutes, please consult kagrox@gmail.com. That's KAGROX@gmail.com.
All right, welcome back now to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Netroots Radio. Let's continue with reading, if I can just find it again. Believe it or not, Jeffrey Toobin. Yes, we are voluntarily reading Jeffrey Toobin's reminder that there is, in fact, a way for Republicans. It's a long shot. It's far-fetched. It won't last forever, but it's only meant to be, they'll take any temporary advantage that they can get. And, of course, if they can just cause chaos, I do remind you, this is the party that actually sacked Congress in January 6th, 2021. So, there's not a lot that they won't try. And I guess in light of the fact that, that was who did that, and that's what happened, and it was an insurrection, and we all regard it as treason and, as an uprising against the government of the United States, why do we think anything is far-fetched, especially if it's like rules-based? It's breaking the rules, bending the rules beyond recognition. But, to sit there and say we're going to do this with a gavel when we've seen them try to do it with clubs and not a few guns stashed away in nearby hotel rooms, by the way, and then pardon themselves for doing it, I suppose it becomes less far-fetched if you think about it that way. And by the way, I was thinking about January 6th just as as an aside. Just last night, it kind of occurred to me. I guess as it dawned on me that this total aside here, total departure from this, but as it dawned on me that we were facing, as we had seen, the semi-quincentennial falling under Trump. Oh no. The 2028 Olympics would be presided over by Trump, assuming he, lives past the congestive heart failure and various other disease, lives that long. That's bad. Oh no. I wish that wasn't happening. But in the middle of all that, the 25th anniversary of 9/11 comes in. How far away are we? A little over a month. And I assume he'll just make a horrific mess of that, and that will upset many people to no end, I'm sure. But it occurred to me, 9/11. There's very few dates in American history that just mention the date and everybody knows what you're talking about. Sometimes you don't have to give the year. Like every time I see it written up in the newspaper, the insurrection at the Capitol of January 6th, 2021. I usually drop the 2021 because when it happened. But if you don't need the year, it's an event. It makes, it was either something fantastic, July 4th, or something terrible, 9/11, September 11th. Everyone knows what you mean when you say September 11th. Nobody thinks you're talking about, you mean September 11th, 1914. No. Everybody knows which September 11th we're talking about. There are other countries that have such dates in their own consciousness. But I was thinking, The only event to gain that level of infamy in American history after September 11th has been January 6th. And everybody knows like what that was and who did it. And we're still stuck trying to keep people accountable for that. And that's amazing. That on a par with 9/11 just in the national consciousness. But also amazing is that some percentage of the country, even if it is only 30% or 35%, I don't know where it falls, 25 to 35%, somewhere in there is the usual range, thinks January 6th was awesome and on a par with July 4th, which is amazing because if you were the kind of person who celebrated September 11th, they said you are a terrorist. And you were a terrorist sympathizer if you were celebrating 9/11. But remember, that's the most infamous charge they can make against people. And this current president still swears to this day that I saw people dancing in the streets in Jersey City and elsewhere on 9/11. Though, no, you didn't see that. But anyway, back to this. I just thought that was an interesting thought. Like, okay, that's where you would classify this thing, this January 6th. It's one of those dates. Like certain people who can just go by one name, and everybody knows who you're talking about. Certain dates, you don't need the year, and everybody knows why you're referring to it. September 11th is a thing. January 6th is a thing. Meanwhile, I guess try to imagine the guy who did, if you can narrow it down to one person, the guy who did September 11th, try to imagine him being elected president of the country, this country. I mean, he's dead, but that doesn't make a difference. Mitch McConnell's dead, and he's a senator. But you get the idea. It would be difficult to imagine that on January 7th, 8th, 9th, trying to imagine the guy who did January 6th being elected president was likewise impossible. But one, things changed as time went on. Two, when they tried to impeach him for having done that, for having gotten past the barrier of you can't impeach a guy who's already out of office. Yes, you can. Once again, don't tell me that's not how things work. It has worked that way in the past. You just forgot. But to have then, of course, decided, well, let's not have any witnesses testify, for instance, because I have a dinner reservation for Valentine's Day. I shouldn't forget that, by the way. Senator Chris Coons, thank you very much. I don't know that I can't tell you that it would have made a difference in the outcome of the vote. Republicans were just, generally speaking, not going to vote to convict a Republican president for partisan reasons. As stupid as that is, I don't know that having witnesses would have made a huge difference, although it is possible in that atmosphere. I guess if they had moved a little bit faster, too, if they had had the witnesses testify, it would become that much more difficult in front of the rest of America to justify voting to acquit. Anyhow, back to the article here. The complicated thing that Jeffrey Toobin, believe it or not, is going to explain to us is now laid out. Democrats have reason to believe that they can win the House in the midterms, as you know. But the path to achieving that victory hinges on a technical detail. Oh no. Well, who knows about such technical details? The point of reading in this article, we do, and we tell you about them all the time, and sometimes not even by plan. It's just something that happens off the top of our heads as it occurs to us. Oh my God, this could happen, and we can explain it to you. And there is no other, I don't think, any other podcast with which I'm familiar that can do that and can do the Trump weave and weave that into and out of the narrative of any given day if the connection is there to be made. Or, in my case, even if the connection is so tenuous as to advise strongly against making that connection. Anyway, Democrats have reason to believe they can win a majority in the House. That's true. But the path to achieving that victory hinges on a technical detail. Federal law assigns the clerk of the House, the chamber's chief legislative administrator, the job of assembling the roll of new members to be sworn in on January 3rd, 2027. So for all the smart people who are quite correct in pointing out, yes, the House reconstitutes itself in its entirety on January 3rd. Well, the membership of the House does, but not the whole House. Not if you include the clerk of the House, and that's an important job. But there's two things there that people don't believe. One, how important the job is, and two, that the clerk continues in office on January 3rd and continues in office despite the fact that there's a new Congress, and continues in office until there is a new clerk, until and unless there's a new clerk elected by the House of Representatives, by the membership. And that despite the fact that all the members' terms end at January 3rd at 12 noon, the clerk doesn't. The clerk is not supposed to be a partisan actor, but is elected by a partisan majority in the House and remains in office. In other words, on July 3rd at noon, when all of the Republican majority lose their seats, the Republican elected, really appointed, clerk of the House remains the clerk of the House and retains the power that they would have exercised ahead of time, probably at this point. They're the ones who say, I will make a list of who shall be admitted to the floor of the House on January 3rd at 12:01 to conduct the business of the House and, accept the credentials of and swear in the new membership. So in comes a Democratic majority believing that they are entitled to access to the House floor to take over. And in fact, they are met at, if you do this, and there's no indication that the current clerk of the House is the kind of person who would readily go along with such a thing. Of course, there's no indication that they won't ask ahead of time, get a no, fire him, and install someone else who will do this. But maybe not. It may be impossible to find a person who would do this because it just means denying all reality and saying the list of people who are to be admitted by the Capitol Police to the floor of the House to constitute the new House shall be all of the Republicans who I believe won their contests, and none of the Democrats, some of the Democrats, some subset of Democrats who I am willing to admit may also have won their elections to the House, but not enough to constitute the Democratic majority to which you believe you're entitled. This is the role. We object. Hundreds of us object. But from outside the hall of the House, because if the clerk of the House and the sergeant at arms and the Capitol Police say, you get in, you get in, you get in, and you don't, and that happens to be a majority of Republicans, where do you go with that? To court, yes. But in the meantime, right? Well, eventually there's no chance that, I know, but how long did they keep Al Franken out? Well, this would be different. This is the entirety of the House. It would be different. Yeah, it might move quicker. But where do you go? How do you make it work? Where do you go? Who do you sue? Who does the suing? How long does it take to rectify itself? Better question is, would a clerk do this? I don't know. Would a president sack the Capitol if he didn't win? Would a president forge electoral college votes if he didn't win? Would a president, if he didn't win, but then he won again later, spend all of his time obsessing about how he really won the second time and this is really his third term and maybe he'll run for a fourth? Yes, he's doing it right now. You know that to be true. Why are you such a doubter? Back to Jeffrey Toobin. The clerk of the House has the job of assembling the roll of new members to be sworn in on January 3rd, 2027. The current clerk is Kevin McCumber, nicknamed Cuke, right? Kevin Cuke McCumber. Anyway, no, not true. Kevin McCumber, chosen for the job in 2023 by Kevin McCarthy. At least it wasn't, Mike Johnson, but, no better. McCarthy, of course, was then the Speaker, but Mr. McCumber previously served in the clerk's office under Speaker Nancy Pelosi. He wasn't the clerk, but he served in the clerk's office, and he is generally regarded as nonpartisan. I don't think McCarthy was the clerk, but maybe an assistant clerk under Pelosi. Anyway, in past years, the clerk's task has been uncontroversial, even unnoticed. That's the issue, as he or she has simply copied the names of the winners onto the roll. Mr. McCumber declined to comment, by the way, for the article. Still, as the Democrats' quasi-official election Cassandra, Mr. Morell, remember him, has been conducting a thought experiment. What if Mr. McCumber isn't in his job long enough to produce the role? That doesn't have to be the thought experiment. It could be, what if they kidnap Mr. McCumber's children? Or what if Mr. McCumber turned out to be an extraordinarily hard-edged partisan Republican and has just never had to show his true colors before? Or what if they do replace him if he doesn't indicate that he'll go along with this? Again, is it far-fetched? I guess, in addition to the other examples that I held up, sacking the Capitol, forging electoral college votes, suppose I told you that at the moment the Department of Justice was pursuing criminal charges against random Americans for vandalizing the reflecting pool, let's say, even though all evidence points to the non-existence of this vandalism, and everything that they say is evidence of the vandalism is in fact not evidence of the vandalism. So much so that the U.S. Attorney for the District of Columbia, a hardened Republican partisan and Fox News commentator, is forced to acknowledge the truth of the situation and dismiss the charges. Would the president and his allies in the cabinet and television and media and government and elsewhere still be standing there backing up the president as he said, no, everyone can see with their own two eyes, even though the video shows something completely different, that I'm correct? And then everybody would say, yes, correct. Would they do that? Would they be that crazy? Could they find the people to do that? They're doing it right now. Think about it. Jeez. I can't believe there are still people who say, yeah, but that's just crazy. They're never going to do that. They sacked the Capitol, guys. Do I think they'll do it again? I don't know. I guess I don't think so. I think that was maybe a one-time craziness thing, but I can't say it's because they've learned any lessons. It may just be they just don't get their act together again. Or maybe they come to the conclusion that that was a bad idea. I don't know how, but they might. So, where were we here? All right. Will Mr. McCumber be in his job long enough to produce the role? One disaster scenario, according to Mr. Morell, would be this. After results show the Democrats winning a majority in the House, the president declares that the election is full of fraud. I'm sure he will do that, right? And the winners don't need to be certified. In fact, he'll probably demand that they not be certified. Mr. Trump could then demand that Speaker Mike Johnson fire Mr. McCumber, which Mr. Johnson has the legal right to do. Under the procedure of the House, the Speaker can install a more compliant successor, that is, a Gop toady. In this scenario, Mr. Johnson's designee, at Mr. Trump's instigation, would produce a roll of new House members that included Republicans in races that Democrats believed they had won, because they actually had. Of course, that would be the basis of the belief. But never mind that. While the Speaker does have the unilateral power to remove the clerk, his choice for a permanent replacement would have to be approved by a vote of House members. Mr. Morell said that in that case, Mr. Johnson might not be able to persuade his slim Republican majority to replace Mr. McCumber. You'd have a number of members who are retiring, who I think would no longer be beholden to Johnson or to the president, who I think would take a very, very dim view of efforts to overturn the election, Mr. Morell said. I think. They might not, though. And of course, let's say Trump captured their families or told all the pardoned January 6thers where their families could be found. Is anything possible? There are January 6thers. Yes, anything is possible. Compounding the complexity, Mr. McCumber, or whoever replaced him, would be in a race against time because of a key difference between the Senate and the House. We do acknowledge it. The Senate is what's known as a continuing body, which operates seamlessly from one year to the next, but the House of Representatives ceases to exist at noon on January 3rd following each election. After that moment, none of its 435 members remain in office unless and until they are sworn in again, although I will remind you of the weird anomaly that doesn't really have explanation, that the members who vote for, who appoint or nominate and then vote for Speaker of the House, the Speaker of the House swears them in, right? So those people who are calling out the names of the people they support for Speaker of the House in the famous viva voce vote, right? Who are they? We don't know. They're not members of the House. They haven't been sworn in yet. So then why are they voting for Speaker of the House? They have to do that. Like, you have to elect the Speaker of the House, right? Yeah. And by the way, who presides in the vote? Who calls the session to order and then begins the vote count and orchestrates all that? Clerk of the House, because they continue in office. Clerk of the House is the presiding officer of the House at the very beginning. Then they vote to elect the Speaker, and then the Speaker swears them in. Then the people who did all the voting become members of the House. Wait a second. The Speaker of the House is elected by people who aren't members of the House? Yes, but they're going to be, because, no one would fake the whole role or anything, right? Right. We just sort of let that go by, because we got to have the House constitute itself somehow, right? And this is the only way we can figure out to do it. So there's rules and there's assumptions about what people will and won't accept as plausible reasons for credentialing one person versus another. And there have been controversies where there was genuinely some disagreement about who won a race in which the clerk had to make a decision. Which certifications to accept, which claim to the seat should be rewarded with a place on the roll, and they've made decisions. Sometimes they decide nobody, and both of the parties have to come and contest their case in front of the House Administration Committee later on, or in front of the House in its entirety. Sometimes it's one or the other. Sometimes it's the member of the party that appointed me to the job as clerk, and sometimes it's not. But it's out there and it happens. Now, compounding the complexity, as we said, there's the race against time, but this is why any delay tactics like those conceived by Mr. Trump's lawyers in the 2020 election could have a particularly bad outcome for the House. Only some employees of the House have a job that carries over from one term to the next. One of those is the clerk. And I think another is the sergeant at arms, and then the Capitol Police who report to the sergeant at arms. Now, in normal circumstances, on January 3rd, the clerk goes to the House chamber with the roll of newly elected representatives. Even though the people on that roll are not yet official members of Congress, the task of electing a Speaker of the House is theirs. The winner of the race for Speaker then swears in the rest of the members of the House, and they can then begin conducting legislative business. But what if by January 3rd the House has not yet approved a replacement for the clerk? That's actually the less troublesome, but that's a good question. Suppose they fire him and they haven't elected a new one. Which newly elected members get to cast that first vote for Speaker? No one knows what would happen. Brian Kalt, a law professor at Michigan State and an authority on House procedures, told me, that is Jeffrey Toobin, you could have votes on who gets to vote. That would be a huge mess. It would get very ugly. And especially since the voting being done on who gets to vote would be being done by people who have not been sworn in as members of Congress, and yet they would constitute the final word, presumably, of who gets in and who doesn't, even though they're not even members. Right? The Constitution guarantees that prerogative to the members of the House. They can determine who will and won't be seated in it. But if none of them are members of the House, do they have that right? At this point, certainly there would be multiple lawsuits asking the courts to sort it out. But historically, federal judges, including those on the Supreme Court, have been reluctant to make rulings about the internal operations of the other branches of government. I think they would lose that inhibition if somehow they settled it in favor of Democrats. They might say, no. The Republicans in the House had the right to do this after all. Go back to the way it was. Whereas if it gets settled in the first instance in the House in favor of Republicans, then they would say, oh, yeah, this is a political question. We can't touch that. At least if the posture is that it's up to them to reverse it at that point. Historically, federal judges, including those on the Supreme Court, have been reluctant to make rulings about the internal operations of other branches of government. We call that the political questions doctrine. Oh, in fact, it comes up in the next sentence. The courts have what's called, you'll never guess, the political questions doctrine, which generally means it's up to the House to solve its own problems, Professor Colt said. Well, it means something broader than that, but that's definitely one of the consequences of it. The House solves its own problems, the Senate solves its own problems, etc., etc. Mr. Morrell plans to keep things as simple as possible. That'd be my plan. Get the certificates in hand from the states and press his colleagues in both parties to abide by those results. Once the certificates of election are forthcoming to the clerk is bound under law and under the courts to put those people on the roll, he told me. Yes, he's bound by law. What else do you do but sue to make it happen if he decides he's not going to do it? The question is, can you prevail in your suit? It's not self-executing, this law. You have to make courts agree that you can, say, issue a writ of mandamus to force the clerk to do this thing. But supposing they don't, I don't know. And then beyond that, might the court say, well, beyond issuing a writ of mandamus, there's nothing we're willing to do because of the political questions doctrine. Sorry, you're going to have to figure this out for yourselves. Presumably, they'll say, this will be something that voters will hold against the Republican Party in the next elections in 2028. But why would you believe that there are going to be any if we're going this far, right? Right. Same thing. Same thing on January 6th, though. And here we are having elections. You have to admit that's still going on. I think. We'll see how it comes out. Anyway, this approach resembles the one that finally brought the presidential election of 2020 to a conclusion. On January 6th, and I don't have to tell you what year, Mr. Trump and his allies suggested all kinds of wrongdoing, never proved, it says parenthetically, that supposedly required suspending or overturning the acceptance of the state's electoral votes in the Senate. But the Senate, led by Vice President Mike Pence, who was its presiding officer at that moment, opted for what members of Congress refer to as regular order. He accepted each state's certification of its results, even though there were alternatives available to him, apparently. Illegal ones, forged ones, but they were there. Mr. Morrell is hoping the full House will do the same in 2027. For all of his concerns, Mr. Morrell is cautiously optimistic about the outcome of any controversy. Me too, I'll say that. I just want to point out that it could happen. The American people, I think, are not going to just sit by while an election, which is given a Democratic majority in the House, is taken away by some subterfuge that involves a removal of the sitting clerk and an acting clerk put in his place. What kind of clerk? Acting clerk, right? Who happens to be an election denier. He said, of course, I think that he also means they wouldn't sit still for the original clerk who isn't fired, who just decides to be a partisan actor and does the same thing. But I guess it's worse if you also fire the guy. Anyway, but he's taking no chances, Morrell says. I still look both ways when I cross what I think is a deserted street. Okay, that's a lousy metaphor for the end of this article, but you get the idea. You want to be aware of the possibilities. Now, we can fully say you are aware. Now, you were aware of these possibilities in January. You were aware of these possibilities probably even earlier than that. This has come up a lot. Actually, pretty much every election of the Trump era, this has come up. There are places where the automatic functioning and so far seamless functioning has given people the impression that there is no seam at all, that these things just happen because they happen. Of course, the list of winners are admitted to Congress. It's not, though, the list of winners. It's the list that the clerk prepares. Every time, or pretty much every time, that the clerk has ever been called upon to prepare that list, it has matched the list of people who the rest of the country had come to understand were, in fact, the winners of that election. But that doesn't have to happen every time. There is free will. He can do it differently than the law, the rules, the norms would otherwise suggest. And although there's really no reason to believe that anybody would be that ridiculous, I can only tell you that it's recent American history that the current president set on foot, one might say, an insurrection against the government of the United States and sent people to sack the Capitol violently and then pardoned everybody who did it. And I don't think they're going to be hesitant to do it again for that reason. Okay. How do you like that? Anyway, the point is, Kagro was right about everything. He was right about the nuclear option and what it enabled, and it wasn't because I discovered it. I didn't. It was there already. It had been used in the past. It had been discussed at length in law review articles. But despite all of that, when you brought it up in the mainstream discussion, people spent years saying, no, you don't understand. That's not how this works. Yes, it is. And in 2013, November of 2013, Harry Reid demonstrated for you all exactly why it really is the way it works. Because he did it right in front of everybody. And if I tell you that this is a possibility for the clerk of the House, and I can demonstrate what the rules are about the continuance in office of the clerk, and I remind you of the fact that they have forged electoral college certificates in the past and then sacked the Capitol when that didn't work, you're going to have to believe that this can happen too. No, it's not the way things work. It isn't the way things have worked, but it is actually, or it isn't, those aren't the outcomes that we got, but it is in fact, and always has been, the way it worked. The clerk has a lot of discretion here. They haven't exercised it, but the discretion is there. And they have exercised it in the past, just not on a grand scale. What if they change their minds about that?
NetworksRadio.com. You have been listening to Kagro in the Morning with David Waldman.
And it's a good thing you've been listening to, because I'm right about everything. Someone suggested that I mock the Trump hats. Trump was right about everything hats, with a Kagro was right about everything hat. I need to sell millions of them to make a dent. But in the meantime, don't worry about other things. If you're sad about not hearing more things that are right, well, don't be. Stay tuned, because Justice Putnam is next, and he's right too.